GameMaker tutorial. This time we're going to take a look at variables and macros. First of all, I'm going to explain how variables work because it's important to know exactly what they can do for you. So, without further ado, variables are basically labels. It's a label with a variable name and you can attach that to a value. And then later, when you ask, hey, I want to know which value this is attached to, you look it up and you get that value back. So basically, it represents a value, and which value it represents can pretty much constantly change, except with a few notable exceptions, which are the macros and some built-in variables that GameMaker uses. And something else to note is that variables in GameMaker aren't for the game entirely, but per object. So if you have a variable that you change in one object, it is not usually changed in the other object, with a few exceptions. As you may recall, last time we set to draw the score here. Score is one such variable which changes throughout the game instead of in one object only. As you can see, I've added up and down keys. It's pretty much the same as left and right. So what we can do now is we can change the variable of score in another object. So let's make another object here. Okay, so what we now can do is use this object to set the score in the other object. Normally GameMaker doesn't allow you to do that. That is why I don't encourage you to use these variables, but it's important to know how they work, so that's why I'm doing this. So let's make a key press here, let's say spacebar, and with spacebar we can then use this button right over here, set variable, to increase the score variable. For that you check relative and 1, which means that you take the value of score and add 1 to it. So let's see how this works now. Okay, so now we have this thing here. If I press space, you can see to the top right here, our score increases. Normally that wouldn't work. I'm going to show you something cool, because right here we're now drawing the score variable. Instead of the score, we can now change this to a variable that GameMaker doesn't usually have, a variable that we ourselves define. So instead of score, we're going to call it points. Now, something important to note, since GameMaker doesn't usually know this variable, we need to let GameMaker know that it is in the game. So what we're going to do is we're going to add this, and now we're setting points to 0. This is very important because now the game knows that the points tag has value 0. Otherwise, if we later want to draw it or add to it, the game is going to complain because it doesn't know which value points is attached to. So now we're going to go back here. We're going to increase the points variable with 1. And now you're going to see something interesting. This still works, it's still 0. And now we press space and we get an error. We're trying to increase points, but the points variable is specific to an object and it doesn't exist in this object that we're trying to increase it in. So how do we fix that, you may ask? Well, it's very easy actually. You see these radio buttons at the top here? This is not something you will use a lot, but sometimes you will, especially in events that have other objects concerned with them, such as collisions. You will use the second button, other, but in this case we're going to use object, and instead of self we're going to select object test, which means that next time it tries to increase the variable points, it will not do so for itself, but it will do so for object test. Something else we can do instead is we can do this. we're going to say this label points is not a label of object 1, as we have still called it here, but it's a label that belongs to object test. So you're going to search for that label and not for your own label. Both of these things work. I personally prefer this one. Let's see it in action. And indeed in the top right it now increases. That's very good. You may think that this is the first we've really done with variables, but that's not true. Let's take another look at object test right here. And let's take a look at the left, up, right and down events. Any of these will do. Jump to position. Okay. You see here X and Y. Now, it's very important to note that X and Y are actually variables. And we're changing them here, even though we didn't know it. So we can do something interesting here. We can draw some variables. We can draw X and we can draw Y. Let's draw the X variable somewhere around here and the Y variable just below that, like that. And now we will be able to see that when we move, these variables are actually changed. And as you can see, the top left is 0, 0 and the bottom right is 800 by 600. We can't get there precisely, but it's pretty close. So, without knowing it, we've already worked with variables. As you may suspect, a lot of these actions right here actually do change variables, which makes it very easy to create behavior even if you don't quite know how variables work. But it's still important to know how they function in order to do more advanced things. For example, changing a custom score variable. If you use a built-in variable, you can only set it once. That's pretty bad if you want to play a multiplayer game, for example. Can you imagine a multiplayer game? Every player has the same amount of score? That's not very fun. So that's pretty much how variables work, but there's one more thing we're going to look at, and that's constants. Some things cannot be changed, and that's good, because for example, this object is named object test. If we refer anywhere to object test, such as in object 1, it will know, hey, it's this object right over here. So even if somewhere we try to assign the object test label to some other value, it'll say no, object test is this object over here, and I can't change that. I can't do that for you, because if I do that for you, the game will screw up. And sometimes you will find that's a little bit limiting, but mostly it's very useful because it makes sure you don't screw up your game badly. So that's what constants are. But there's one more thing we need to do. We're going to look at macros. Right here in all configurations, you see that we have name, value. We can add, insert, do anything mostly. Now we're going to do something interesting. We are going to add, let's say, test, and we assign the value 80 to it. It's usually written in caps. You can write it any way you like, but most people prefer to write variable names that cannot change in full caps. Yes, we save our changes, and then we are going to draw another value. We are going to draw the value of test, and we're going to draw it somewhere over here. There it is, 80. Now we're going to do something fun. If we press left, we are going to change the value of test. We're going to add 1 to it. Let's see if that works. Alright, it says we have a compile error. In event keyboard, action number 37 at line 1. Oh, what's that? We click on it, set variable test to 1. Well, why can't they do that? Macros are variables that cannot be changed. Anytime we refer to object test, it is this object, and anytime in a game we refer to test right over here, it will be 80, and that cannot change. This is very important if you use certain values throughout your game, such as say you have a male character or female character and you want to check for that. It's very easy to do something like this. And then later you can check which one it is by simply using male and female instead of continuously having to use the somewhat vague values of 0 and 1. So that's basically how that works. We can clear this now because we don't really need it. We are going to remove anything that has to do with test, because otherwise the game will crash. And now we know how variables work. It doesn't matter that we didn't get a lot done, because this episode will pave the way for any future game you want to make. Variables are very, very important. Next time we are going to look at collisions and movements, which is another interesting topic, and we will actually build our first true game mechanic. I hope to see you then. Goodbye.